Just to highlight a couple of notable features about the New Zealand economy. If we look at the last 8 years or so since the global financial crisis, it looks as though we've done very well compared with many other countries in terms of pretty fast growth, jobs being filled, and longer hours being worked. We hold the record for being the third fastest growth in work hours per person in the OECD, 2009 to 14. And of course, we've benefited from some very high prices for some of our commodity exports. But if we look at that growth in the most important way, which is real GDP, i.e. minus inflation, but per capita, and we adjust all this growth for the fast growth of the population, thanks to good net migration coming into the country, the economy over those 8 years has grown by less than 1% a year in real GDP per capita terms. And we have done that in spite of a low rate of productivity growth. So productivity seen as the value created per person per hour worked is the standard measure. And we continue to languish down the bottom end of the OECD in terms of that productivity growth. So we are still trying to make our way in the world with relatively low value goods that we produce very efficiently. Once again, we've had light shed on that, most recently by the Productivity Commission late last year in its research report, Achieving New Zealand's Productivity Growth, and dealing with that paradox of efficiency but low value. And I just want to highlight one particular comment in that Productivity Commission report. New Zealand's leading frontier firms have mostly had a weaker productivity performance than global frontier firms in the same industry, indicating poor technology diffusion into the economy. Then, if we just look very briefly at household debt, we are at a record of household debt per household is 167% of disposable income. It's not the highest in the world, but it puts us in the top 5 or 6. And households are managing that because interest rates are low. And a very large part of that debt, of course, represents housing. So in the most recent year, household borrowings were up 9% to $248 billion, and a large part of that very heavily driven by housing debt, which was $230 billion of that. And lastly, the environmental picture. A couple of months ago, the OECD delivered its once every 10-year review of New Zealand's environmental performance. And I will just offer you one quote from this because I think it encapsulates a lot of this stress that our economy and environment are under. New Zealand's growth model has started to show its environmental limits with increased greenhouse gas emissions, freshwater contamination, and threats to biodiversity. Addressing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and especially dairy farming should remain a priority. The need to further explore the economic opportunities that more sensible uses could yield from that land. But here's the really big point, I would add. Developing a long-term vision for a transition towards a low-carbon, greener economy would help New Zealand defend its green reputation it has acquired at an international level. So that's the context. The economy has gone quite well. It's probably not sustainable. We are all working very hard that moving along in technology and productivity terms and in a sound environmental context are some of the great challenges. So to get the discussion going, I suggested to our panelists that we just start with a simple sort of 5-minute statement from each of them about why invest, how do they see it from their perspective, what are our investment and drivers, what are we wanting from our returns in that. And I suggested that we go in the order of Stephen first, and so So, Stephen.
I purposely sat two away from you.
Yeah, no, so, a random seating arrangement, a fixed speaking arrangement. So, Stephen, why invest?
Well, I'll kind of speak from my venture capital side and a little bit about what we do through the Tindall Foundation, but what I hope we do is we invest for impact. So there is a movement called impact investing, which people are starting to get involved in. But what it's all about is actually looking at causes and then looking for ways that you can invest that actually help the country. Not everything we've invested in would be for an environmental reason, but quite a number of them are. And I think about, for example, a company we've invested in which has established itself now in just out of Gisborne called Wood Engineering, timber, W-E-T. And what that company does is it chops up the very large number of logs, that we're exporting every year to China in particular for very low value. Chops them up into little pieces and then glue lams them back together, which makes incredibly strong structural timber. You use every single piece of the tree, and it's only going to be producing its first timber this year, but all the economic studies show that we will be able to basically sell this timber at a premium, and we've eliminated this problem of selling lots and lots of low value trees. Now, what you hope will happen from that is a burgeoning timber industry. We know at the moment our net industry for timber is we're cutting it down. We need to start growing a lot more. That probably leads into something we're doing through the Tindall Foundation, and Simon Miller's here from Pure Advantage tonight, and that's called Trees That Count. And we've gone through a very good piece of research that David did to work out that if we plant enough trees over the next 20 or 30 years, and our ambition of 187 million of them, we can possibly get back to pre-1990 carbon limits, because we can sequester a lot of the carbon. So there's a kind of a tree theme. Another area that we've been very excited about is taking waste. So there's two companies we've invested in that take waste and turn it into valuable products. The first one started up at Glenbrook at the steel mill here in Auckland. It's now migrated to Chicago, and what it does is at the moment it's taking waste from steel mills, and so it comes off the smokestacks of steel mills, and it turns it into ethanol. And just one of these plants make millions, in fact billions of litres of ethanol. Another one that's spun out of the steel mill as well is taking slag from steel mills that use iron ore from sand, so sand, and there are a number of those around the world. We're not unique in New Zealand that does that, and we can turn that into titanium dioxide. Titanium dioxide sells as a commodity on the world market at the moment for $2,400 per tonne, US dollars, and we can make it for much, much less than the industry makes it. Now, the other really good thing about that is, A, you use up the slag, but B, the toxicity of the manufacture of titanium dioxide is dire. It is just terrible. So what we hope will happen is all these other plants will close down, and there'll be a whole lot of our plants around the world instead. So there's just a couple of examples on that side. In terms of impact investing from a philanthropy point of view, the best example that I could suggest at the moment that we've experienced is in housing. So we've supported a group which we helped get started about 18 years ago called the New Zealand Housing Foundation, and they build houses for low-income people, but from an ownership perspective. So we think about the housing continuum of social housing down here, where you actually have people on benefits and sometimes actually keep people locked in because they can't get on the property ladder, and they just keep renting all their lives, or the houses provided all their lives by the state. to over here where you actually own your own home. And we think we come in more towards the own your own home area because we provide joint equity so people can actually afford to buy a house, but buy it with someone else who helps provide some of the capital, but also rent to buy. And there's some fantastic examples around the world of housing foundations or communities that actually work together in areas that actually have far better outcomes than you see in ghetto areas of social housing. So there's my penny's worth.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for touching those very important bases, whether it be in terms of generating greater value from what's now a commodity product, but also dealing with environmental issues along the way. And the two Glenbrook examples of getting us down that road to circular economies where we make sure we use everything. And then the social housing too, so thank you. Mary, you next, if I may. In terms of your perspective from all the technology ventures you have seen, that sense of why invest and what are you after from them?
Well, thanks, Rod, and thanks particularly for including me on the panel. When you posed the original question and I thought about, well, why invest? And I was thinking of it from the perspective of, everyday New Zealanders, if you like, but not people who are necessarily highly working in the area of professionally investing and so forth. I think for all of us, you invest to achieve the dream, be able to fund dreams and goals for the future, and whether that's down payment for your first home, or it's being able to set up a foundation and make a change in communities, or whether it's investing for retirement. It's really having that ability to fund a vision, your own vision of what you want the future to be. So the interesting thing then is saying, well, it's a good thing to invest, for everybody to invest. It comes down to, well, what do people choose to invest in and why? And it seems to me people do invest in what's familiar. And I sort of, having lived most of my working life in the United States and then coming back to New Zealand in 2013, it's really interesting to see that the norm in New Zealand is investing in real estate, and particularly residential real estate, but to some extent commercial, whereas the norm, at least of people that amongst my friends and colleagues in the States, was to invest to buy stock, and some balance between corporate stocks and bonds, and have a bit of funds set aside for startups. And usually for a lot of people, they're not picking individual stocks, but are investing in through mutual funds or managed funds. So quite interesting, the difference, and a perception, I think, in New Zealand that stocks in companies, and particularly smaller entrepreneurial companies, is much riskier than investing in real estate. So I think there's sort of part of the thinking about how to change the future is how to make sure everybody sort of fully understands the relative risks, and that ratio of debt to income. And of course, I'm on the board of Westpac New Zealand, the bank here, and of course the Reserve Bank is sort of talking about should there be debt to income criteria for mortgages and so forth in the future, is one of the things the Reserve Bank is thinking about. So I think the risk of investing or being too heavily invested in real estate isn't maybe very obvious, and it's that if interest rates go up from these abnormally low levels, or historically low levels, drop in housing prices, the lack of liquidity from having 80 to 100% of your investment in real estate, so lack of liquidity and lack of diversification, because at least with investing more in stocks, you can be spread across a number of industries. You can be in stocks within New Zealand, but also overseas in the US or in the European Union or in Asia. So I think that relative risk is not very widely understood maybe by a lot of people. I'm absolutely in favour of everyone buying their own home to live in, roof over your head, of course, but it's, what do you invest in beyond that? And then the other thing, in looking at it from the perspective of the exposure I got to what's happening in New Zealand at Callahan Innovation, just about every company I'd talk to, I'd say, what's holding you back from growing bigger faster? And they say, I can't hire enough skilled people or find the skills I need, and I can't find the capital to grow my business. So it seems to me that when so much money is tied up in the bricks and mortar of houses, which after all, a house is just a house, it can still just house a family, there's not really any value created other than what's driven by demand. Whereas if that same money is going into these exciting companies, Stephen, that you're describing, far more value created, and I think that plays a role in that productivity gap that New Zealand has, that we're not seeing the productivity because we're putting all this money into something that isn't inherently any more valuable than it was a year ago or 10 years ago. It's just a house or an apartment that you can live in, or a factory that you can work in. But if it's in businesses, they've got this much greater capacity to grow. And this fear about the risk of technology, I think you overcome that by having funds where you can invest in a fund that's got 30 companies in it, spreads it across, or funds that invest in different industries, so healthcare, for example, or some of the very exciting artificial intelligence companies emerging, and as well as in natural resources. So I'll pause there, and just sort of those are my initial thoughts from the topic.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Look, terrific territory to explore there, particularly about how to change that investment psychology in New Zealand for retail investors, but also institutional investors too, who are very conservative in New Zealand. But secondly, that question about how to grow some of these technology companies faster, and I look forward to coming back to that. Thank you. Rangimarie, a Ngāti Whātua perspective and the sort of things you get up to in investment terms.
Tuatahi tēnā koutou katoa, kia kua tai raro I te karanga o tēnei kaupapa anō reira ngā mihi kia koutou. I think first, before I start about why investing, it is important to take a moment to celebrate the successes. And I am sitting next to Stephen Tindall, and last week was probably one of the few moments we've had in a long time to be able to celebrate the brilliance of this nation. And I think when I think about the idea of why invest, let's just think about what's great about the country and how simple successes that can occur across miles and miles of sea and other countries. This little country at the bottom of the world can sit there and enjoy it. There's not one person in this country who did not feel proud for the win. And so when I think about this idea of why invest, let's understand too that as a small nation, our successes are the country's successes. And so when I think about and I don't think this is just a Ngāti Whātua view, I think it's the country's view, that we are small, we need to be able to unite, to be able to make global impact, but we make one little amazing impact and we all feel that. And so our responsibility, I think, is for us all to be in the game, to understand that we're all in this together. And that's probably our biggest benefit. So now I'll finish the philosophising. I'll get back into the question of why invest. From a tribal perspective, our role in life is to take care of the perpetual estate of the tupuna. So we don't own individually anything. We are in service to the vision of our ancestor. And from Ngāti Whātua's perspective, we are all connected to this, to our success of investment around Tupuriri, who came down here in 1740. So he's about 8 generations away from my mum, so about 9 generations from me. And so he gave us an opportunity, and it's our job to look after that. So when I think about intergenerational investment, it's not just an ideology, it's a reality, it's a fact. And so I think if he was sitting here next to me today, he would be saying, your role is to support people to live powerfully. And to live powerfully means we need to think very differently about how we want, what people are doing and how people are doing it. And I would think that he would be sitting here beside me saying, don't forget it's not just the physical, but it's also the fact that you are blessed to be sitting on this earth. And she has a name, she has a face, and she has the right to be cared for by you. And that's papatūānuku, and that's why we think about the care, and that's why sustainability is such a simple idea when you get back to the basics. And so I think about investment, and we think about investment very much over the long term. And I think for us, it's not just about money, but it's about mana. And mana is about how people feel as a consequence of that investment going well. So I think about what we've done. We are long-term. We're a long-term investor. We haven't really matured to the point, I think, where we're thinking about offshore investment, where we're diversifying radically into new domains. We're just not there yet. We're only, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei is, we settled in 2011, so we are only, we're only very young. And I think about us as being just kind of into our primary school years. But what I've found is that in our primary school years, we've started with 300 million and gone to kind of $1 billion in 7 years. So that growth actually takes a little bit, there's some speed wobbles in there. So when I think about investing, actually it's about how do you manage that speed wobble and then growth for what? So we are in that point that we have to start thinking about impact investing, but impact investing in that we've got, from our people's perspective, we've got a lot of work to do to correct a whole lot of stuff that's just kind of gone off balance. I think about housing, and housing is not going to be a reality unless we do something quite radically different, particularly for our people. We've just finished a development in Ōrākei, and one of the things that became really clear for us is that 10 people in those out of those 30, so that's a third of the population, aren't just first-time homeowners, they're first-generation homeowners. So when I think about impact, what is the impact of a first-generation family actually starting on that journey? We're probably a couple of 100 years behind a whole lot of other people, but now we've got to accelerate everything that means and all the different bits that go with it, because they're not only taking that home, they're taking their broader family in there and changing reality. So I'm really enjoying not just the invest in a house and bricks and mortar, but also you're investing actually in the changing of people's lives and changing mindsets. So it's a very much a investment toward the regeneration. I think that's my 5.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much indeed. Some terrific topics to follow up on there, not the least of which what $1 billion of assets does for the sense of legacy, the future.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a legacy, and yeah, we're lucky.
Thank you.
They've made some
And Josh, you come at this in many terrific ways, both in terms of your view of organisations and technology. But so I'm keen on to hear your sense about investment.
I think the question of why invest, for me, it prompts the realisation that all of us are beneficiaries of a huge amount of wealth that we didn't earn. And if you think about the knowledge that is passed down to us, you think about our inheritance from previous generations, the health of the planet, none of that we earned, we're beneficiaries, that was given to us. And I think fundamentally the appropriate relationship with that inheritance is one of stewardship, that we should look to preserve and enhance that for people who come after us. So whether it's money, whether it's knowledge, whether it's skills, whatever we receive or are given or are fortunate to earn ourselves through our own labour, we should treat like a burden that we're stewarding for others. And so that makes investment the most rational course of action for me. When I think about investment, I take quite a broad view. Like, yes, you can invest money, but you can also invest time, you can invest reputation. There's lots of other things at play. And if we only measure one of them, I think it's an incorrect view of reality. So if I invest money and I put down $10 and in a year I make $100, that looks pretty good. But if that cost everyone in this room $5, then that looks much more like extracting from an economy than actually investing and creating value. And say it's not just money, say I hurt everyone here and everyone's health diminished a little bit, or I put lots of carbon into the atmosphere in the process of making my $90 sort of surplus. Again, it's not a true investment, it's not a true creation of value. And I think without discussing and measuring and talking about the other things we value apart from money, we can't really talk about investing correctly. And so I think a lot of, when I think about investing, it's about trying to find the opportunities where the possibility space of the future and our current reality, where there's a gap, where there's something that's possible that is more beautiful, more powerful, more wonderful for all of us, and there's a stepping stone ways to get there. And it's never a sure path, there's always risk in there. So it's about sacrificing current wealth in the hope of future wealth. And I think when we broaden away from more than just money and more than just one individual or one organisation to all of us, we can have a much more accurate picture of that. So personally, and I think there are also a few different types of outcomes I think we can talk about. Some of them are direct outcomes, like, okay, housing's an issue. If I invest some money or some time or some reputation or get lots of people together, maybe we can help more people have access to affordable housing. It's a direct outcome, and most people would applaud you for doing that. It's like great work, it's a good thing. But I think there's also catalytic outcomes we can try and invest in as well, such as what's the system which is making housing unaffordable? What are the root drivers that actually do that? And if you look at the taxation system and lots of others, there are systemic causes to unaffordable housing. And if you try and change those systems, then you'll actually have to fight lots of people to do it, because a lot of people benefit from the current system, whereas if you just go and do your thing, direct outcomes I think are less risky and cheaper to get, but often they'll be less powerful, whereas the catalytic outcomes, much more expensive, much more risky, and often it's a battle, but that's where we can really shift and get large-scale returns. And so I think when you're talking about policy, I think it's one of the most catalytic things you can do, but the actual art of getting new policy passed, which benefits lots of people, but maybe it doesn't benefit some people, that's a very difficult thing to do in our society. And I think the final piece I would add is that when you look around at the systems, like the political systems, the financial systems, the legal systems, and all the incentives that go in different directions and chase their own tails, I think that our global society is deeply inelegant and flawed. I can imagine a society which is so much more beautiful in lots of ways. And you can start to look at our climate, you can look at slavery, you can look at the financial system. There is no end of systemic change needed to actually make this world better, which is, I think, a good thing, because a lot of us get a lot of value from trying to do that change. So I think that it's never been a more exciting time to be alive and to take this frame of how can you invest to make a more beautiful world. And I think the final thing was, I think people invest in what is familiar, but that's some of the best advice I've heard as well, which is around invest in what you know, because when you invest in stuff you don't really understand, you'll usually make bad decisions. And I think the challenge is to extend what is familiar to us. So learning about something which I don't really understand means I can act much more usefully and powerfully in that space. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Fine, thank you very much indeed. And there's some very big ambitions there for investing in terms of bringing about very big systemic change. Thank you. What I was going to suggest is that we just at this stage take 2, 3, 4 questions from you all, or comments, just to get a sense of the mood of the room as to where we might go in our discussion. So we won't answer them one by one. I'll kind of synthesize or pull them together, or perhaps reflect on some of the things we've already heard from our panelists. But what's on your minds? Where should we go with this conversation? Any takers? Yes.
My name's Simon Stockdale. Been involved in a number of startup companies in some of the areas that Stephen's talked about, and some of Josh's more technical areas. And there's a well-known situation in New Zealand of an investment cliff, that it's quite easy to get investment as a startup, maybe 500, 1 million, 1.5 million. But then there's a cliff that you fall off, that if you're out there looking for maybe 3 or 4 million, it's really, really difficult to find it, far more difficult to find than if you needed 50 million. There's just sort of no interest. So interested from the panel on their views as to how that sort of gulf can be filled. And I guess specifically I'm interested because we've got someone who's on the board of a bank here. If I want to invest in a New Zealand startup fund, can I go to, does Westpac, or do the other banks offer that? Because my experience in the past is when I wanted to invest in sustainable funds is that the banks have been incredibly slow to respond to the appetite that perhaps some of the more forward-thinking citizens have around, where they want to invest. So the great aspirations about where we would like to invest, but for the average person who's got some money to invest, what are the vehicles out there for them to invest in those good things?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Simon. Hang on, microphone on the way, thanks.
Yeah, my name is also Simon. I was curious with Mary's comment about the value creation, and that's really, really true. So the question is, the thought is to float to you, is how do we change the narrative from the leaders of the country into, so we have value creation in housing for a number of levels. The market systems work for that, and it's the way of life, but it's also a global fear that everyone wants to come to New Zealand and migrate here for a lot of other reasons, right? Geopolitical uncertainty. So how do we change the value creation into investing in companies that matter to New Zealand? Because the present narrative is all about seed investing, scale, export, go offshore. And so whereas a lot of the conversations that I'm interested in are how do we create a lift domestically, and that may be social or maybe economic, technological, and this, that, and the other thing. So that's really what I think will raise the bar in New Zealand. So just curious on that thought.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Could I perhaps take, oh yes, thank you very much indeed. Oh, are you just holding the microphone?
I was just holding the mic, but I'll talk anyway, Rod.
Good use of the microphone.
My name's not Simon, it's Bill. I guess a couple of things that are raised that are interest to me, the sort of, I guess Josh laying out the sort of investment horizon, in 4 dimensions rather than one, the financial dimension, and I know, and Rangimarie is nodding her head all the way through, and so I'm sort of interested in the how. What are the things that can move the dial in terms of that, in terms of moving us from where we are today to that. And then the other thing that interests me, which is sort of a more specific thing, but in New Zealand, economy is basically an agricultural-based economy. And if you take a 30-year view of the things that are underpinning our economy at the moment, then I can't help thinking that there are going to be synthetic answers to doing what we're doing at the moment. And while we talk about climate change and addressing environmental impacts, and a lot of us are sort of involved in doing our bit around that, I can't help thinking that actually it's going to be today's young people choosing plant-based meat products over what we now call natural meat products. That's actually going to drive really significant change in that space. So I'm interested in any perspectives on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those excellent questions and points. Let me just start this way. We've got a strong view from the questions, but obviously a strong sense from the panelists too of how we do business changing. So it's not just the technology, but it's the drivers of that business. So my first question is a relatively straightforward one, which is, do we think that existing business models can adapt to be able to deliver the diversity of outcomes we want and deal with these longer term horizons? Or are we looking at a very different approach to what a business model looks like? Any sense of that from you? Yeah.
I think they have to be different. There's a young lady in Auckland that's making chicken out of, I think, chickpeas. We've seen it happen through Google's Stanford University, so there's got to be a will to do it, but you're not going to get a meat company to do it. You're going to get a technology company to do it. Unless a meat company really sees it as a massive threat and gets into it themselves, then I think it's a new model. And we're seeing disruptive new models disrupting absolutely everything right now, aren't we? I mean, who would have thought that the media industry is going offshore at the speed it is? So, if you take my business, The Warehouse, it's just, we've got normal media in New Zealand that I have worked with for over 40 years disappearing, and advertising is going to California-based companies like Google and Facebook, and all the value is going offshore. But unless it's a new model, a disruptive model, I don't think you're going to get the change that we need.
Mary, from your perspective, when you're looking at New Zealand technology companies, is there much of a move amongst them towards radically different business models, or are many of them still trying to just progress technology in a relatively conventional business model?
Yeah, I mean, I think New Zealand has this amazing seed crop of businesses. I've been just stunned at the range of technologies that you'll find companies around New Zealand investing in and developing, and the incredibly clever ideas. But there's, and to your point, Simon, one, that there really is this cliff, this investment gap when you can get the first couple of million from friends, family and fools, and then maybe, and there's a quite vibrant angel investor environment in New Zealand, but there's then this big gap when you kind of need to get the next step. And often that's not necessarily to do more R&D and product development. Very often that's to invest in sales and marketing and distribution channels. And somehow that's not as appealing to the investor environment that we have. It's great because we kind of really love the widgets and coming up with a cool idea once the prototype's there. But when you've got to build, we're a nation of being fantastic at creating products, but not great at building businesses, with some notable exceptions right here on the panel. And so this idea that, you've got to build marketing capability, and you've got to have a great CFO, and you've got to have, HR talent in your organisation. There's some needs there, I think, to actually construct those startups in a way that they are investable, because I encountered that quite a bit too, and I'm sure, Stephen, you see that, and Josh, that a lot of entrepreneurs in New Zealand are reluctant to give up equity for capital, or to build their company in a way that makes it attractive to investors, equity investors particularly. So, I think that there's quite a bit of learning to be done, and an interesting thing from a policy perspective, how do we as a society invest in education and training in a way that, kids learn from an early age those skills, and thinking that way, and thinking about how do I want to measure value from this business? It's not just, it's that whole, not a new idea of the triple bottom line, social, environmental and economic. But I think there really is a growing movement by consumers to put pressure on companies to say it's not enough to pay a dividend in dollars or, to meet my needs. If you are damaging the environment, if you are discriminating against on the basis of who you employ, those are unacceptable behaviours. So I think there is growing social pressure from consumers to change business models, change the way companies behave.
I might jump in there too, because I think the whole idea of do we need to change the business models, the answer is yes, and I think there are a couple of points here. One is around the education system and actually building a fit-for-purpose group of people that can engage in that space. So I think about some of the innovations, and Bill's been huge in that with like Manaia Kalani. are our tertiary institutions actually getting our young people fit for purpose to be able to engage in these? And I think the answer is at the moment, no, not really. And so when I think about the need for new business models, I am asking the question whether or not the tertiary institutions are actually preparing for that. And I'm seeing that not only from that transition from school into tertiary, but also I look at the work that we're doing in the primary sector. One of the groups that I'm involved with is Te Hono, and we've been taking whole groups over to Stanford, and we've been doing a couple of things. One, learning different, understanding this whole idea of disruption, but also sitting in the room together as people who are passionate about the country and the primary sector and figuring out and what. And if we ask the question, would they invest in New Zealand institutions to be able to develop the types of things that they need? The answer is no. So we've got a real tension here around that piece there. I think the other part for me, which is really, I think Mary talked about this, is around the way that we invest. And so I'm thinking particularly from the way that it's not just the consumers that are driving change, it's also the owners that are driving change. So one of the other groups that I'm involved in, we do fish. So I sit on the Māori Fisheries Commission, and we have a third of the country's fishing quota, and we represent 57 iwi. Now that's probably all of the iwi, less 3 maybe. So it's heaps. It's very clear. Iwi are very clear. They are really clear, not only about being able to deliver some profit, but how you deliver it, why you deliver it, and the story that you're taking offshore to be able to share the beauty of this country is becoming very, very important. So one of the major things that I thought was absolutely bizarre is that we have a whole lot of crayfish quota, and it gets packed up in a New Zealand box, and it's called New Zealand crayfish, and then it arrives in Hong Kong, and they take the sticker off and call it Australian lobster. I find that offensive. But the good thing was, so did 57 iwi. So we've gone down a track, which is to say, in actual fact, we're going to have to start thinking very clearly about our brand proposition and owning that chain from the moment that we catch coda to the moment that people are eating it in their homes. We've never been involved in that conversation around that value chain, and we're starting to go offshore to be very clear and deliberate about that. But what we're also finding is that in doing that, we've been able to extract greater value from that. So it's not about quantity, it's about the quality, and it's actually about the authenticity of the story, and the story is founded in the way that we do stuff. So I'm really excited by that as a business model, because it's not just being driven by the idea of value in terms of the end value. It's being driven by values that people have about what they will connect to, and also driven by what people will buy. And I think that's a global phenomena. Authenticity and connection to the story is becoming important. And I think we've got something to be proud of here. But we're not doing it at scale well enough.
Let me just pick up on that point exactly and refer back to the question about synthetic food. Is it possible for New Zealand to do both? Can we be credibly a producer of synthetic meats, whether it be grown from stem cells or plant-based, at the same time doing conventional food as well? Or do we have to make a choice in terms of what our brand proposition is and where our science lies, our capabilities lie? And
We can do both, no problem. Wherever there's demand, you can satisfy it.
Yeah. The only company that I know of that is embracing both is Danone, which is not only a very large milk processor, but has also spent a lot of money buying White Wave in the US, which is the maker of synthetic milk. It's a very rare example of a conventional company embracing the disruptive technology. And it's hard to imagine our dairy farmers who are heavily invested in their land making such a similar leap of technology. Do you think that's possible?
If I put put my mum hat on now. I've got 4 kids, 18, 15, 9 and 7. And these children, when I think about the conversations we're having at our dinner table compared to what I was having at my dinner table 30 years ago, they are conscious consumers, these kids. They know exactly where their food is coming from. They've got views about the world and the environment, and I think they will force, actually, this younger generation, and you think about the curriculum they're learning in schools, these kids care about where they come from, they care about the environment, and they will care about what goes into their stomachs. It's just a reality of life. And so I think as parents, as grandparents, as great-grandparents, we actually have a responsibility to do both. But they will probably tell us, without a doubt, they're going down one track, as long as it tastes yummy when you put some sauce and tomato sauce on that steak or whatever, however you cook it. But it's coming. They're too conscious, you know.
We absolutely have to do both, because we're sort of running out of farmland on the traditional business model with all the environmental pressures that's having. So why, I mean, I can see a scenario where the brand for the, you know, this meat or milk came from a real cow has a price point up here, and this meat that came from a lab, I mean, the cow's just a lab that's taking input chemicals and processing them and putting the output product out. So, you know, the chemistry of it is no different, but there's, as you say, a whole branding thing. So it depends how we in New Zealand define ourselves. If we define ourselves as a cow country, then we've got a problem. If we define ourselves as a food, high-value, nutritious, environmentally sound food company, then absolutely we can be developing, you know, what comes from the lab as well.
Yes, but dependent on a very much more stringent view of the environment.
Yeah. So where every hectare of land is being used to produce a far higher value good, and then other sources of nutrition can come from without using the land to the same extent.
Let me just loop back, because it's getting to be a real challenge where this conversation's going in terms of we're looking for new business models, greater pressure on businesses, and much more demanding technology. But we've still got this question of how to bring other investors along in that, particularly sort of retail ones, to get people used to investing more widely. Is that, how might we do that? How might we encourage people to invest in these very exciting forms of business? Or is that just going to be plain too hard an ask for retail investors, particularly if we are conscious of that investment philosophy of investing in things we know? How might we square that circle?
Who are you looking at there, Rod?
Anybody who might have, I don't have an answer to that, so I'm no pressure on you.
Well, there are, I think, 2 good things that are helping there. One is KiwiSaver, because people may not be visibly seeing it, but a lot of that investment money's going into businesses, I think, but there may be people who know in the audience and at the table know more about that. And the other is the emergence of crowdfunding, which creates a mechanism that, you know, everybody can really start to learn about and have a way of accessing investing in companies.
I think, Rod, I've been doing this now for 23 years, and I've always had this philosophy that A, I will only invest in New Zealand companies or New Zealand technologies, and B, that if I can get enough real winners, then more people will come. And when we started, there was no seed capital going on with angels whatsoever. And there were very few people actually getting into venture capital, but I've just seen that starting to absolutely blossom. The thing about it is, and kind of trying to answer Simon's question, is that there is actually no shortage of capital if you've got something that looks incredibly profitable. People will pile in like crazy, you know. But the other thing is, I think, if you've got something that looks really attractive to the world, then that's even better. So if you take one of my investments called Rocket Lab, as soon as that entrepreneur, Peter Beck, was able to show, in fact, he came to us for money, we gave him money to get started, and helped him for quite a long time. And then when he really needed it, we sent him to Silicon Valley and we pointed him at several venture capital companies. And I think he needed 35 million. He got the 35 million from the first one he visited. So if the value proposition is compelling, people will invest in it. But to Simon's question, we've got to get more and more people into this. And my philosophy was if you can get quite a number of winners, people will then start to follow because they'll see it's a better proposition than buying half a dozen houses.
I think fundamentally you need to offer people better deals, and there's not one thing which can do that. So in terms of the number of people who would like to put their KiwiSaver fund in a place where they know there will be ethical or non-financial returns as well as financial ones, I believe is quite large, and I've know people who are asking for it, and there are people who are working on doing it. And it's when you start to put those deals in front of people and other people see the consequences of that in the market, then I think you'll start to see people adjusting. It's like we were talking about farming and synthetic meats and whatnot. My perspective is that's analogous with where the fossil fuel industry was 15 years ago. And if you look at where society's been going with climate change, all of a sudden to own a coal mine is dishonourable. Like there's something about that now where it's been stigmatised culturally, not just the financial numbers of it. And I think that when you start to look at the impacts of meat on climate and then plant-based alternatives, there's a real risk to our economy that in 15 years, people will look at naturally grown meat as something which harms everybody as opposed to more greenhouse efficient ones. And that could be a real significant risk to an industry, and that it will either be the fear of that happening, which will get established players to shift, or it will be the opportunity of a massive new market with profit margins and whatnot, which will get new players to enter, but that will kind of win out in a way. So I feel that when we talk about people changing, the most inspiring thing for me in the last sort of 30 years has probably been cell phones. It's that in the 1991, first sort of GSM network 2, and they didn't have to convince everyone, or they didn't have to get regulation or bully people or like lobby to get everyone to use cell phones. They just showed something that was really useful and effective, and it just spread like a virus throughout the planet. And I think that for people really wanting to make systemic impact is we need to find the viruses which are not just profitable, not just good, not just like cell phones, but have massive systemic positive impacts as well. So things which will take carbon out of the atmosphere, or that will help housing become affordable, or politics become easier to more responsive. Like there's lots of things to improve, and I think trying to find those things that can spread like a virus throughout the wider global system, that's the gold to hunt for.
Just picking up on one aspect of that relates to Simon's question about does that deliver enough for the domestic economy? And those sorts of companies that have some reach internationally, but for all sorts of practical reasons, might not have that much of a footprint in New Zealand.
Well, I think if you are discerning and you put that lens on those things, then absolutely. I mean, I think of all the things we've invested in, we always say, what's the benefit for here? Not what's the benefit for the rest of the planet. I mean, if the rest of the planet benefits as well, that's great. But if you grow the value of the business in New Zealand, and if you, for example, the Lanzatech happens here at the steel mill, so does the one I was telling you about with the titanium. It's creating jobs and value in New Zealand, but you're selling the IP overseas. The wood one, if you take it to its logical conclusion, can actually fire up a whole industry of sustainable wood, and the value's here in New Zealand. So I think if you're purposeful about it, absolutely, it'll work.
Lanzatech, though, raises a very interesting question because that's fabulous technology. It's very good because Sean Simpson and colleagues thought very differently about how to create synthetic feedstock for plastics or for fuel via ethanol because they were biologists. And then that made, where other people were herring off down other roads, that made great sense because we're very much a biology-based economy in all kinds of ways. But then I understand exactly why Lanzatech has moved pretty much lock, stock and barrel to Chicago, and I fully support that. But the huge opportunity lost was there was an ability, or there was an opportunity, to develop other biology-based businesses in these new areas of clean technology here in New Zealand. But Sean and colleagues fundamentally failed to persuade the government that there was an opportunity there. So how...
That was around GMOs.
Yeah, and well, boy, we're really deep, diving deep into the thickets here.
Yeah.
Because...
but that's a big choice, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
GMOs versus profit, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
In that case, theirs was completely safe because as soon as it got into the atmosphere, it died.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, sometimes it's really hard to convince people that you can have a good GMO.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But those particulars are incredibly important about the GMO debate about that. But there's the bigger issue as to whether we have enough of a sense of that big horizon that we're working to, and whether, as a country, we have some sort of coordination around that, and can bring together science and business and government in a constructive way. What do you reckon, Mary, as to whether we have that capability to be forward-thinking at scale like that?
Sort of like across the board, or
Yeah.
in the case of individual companies?
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
the discussion very quickly gets into, we mustn't pick winners, so I'm trying to avoid
my
language of that
Yeah,
kind.
yeah, absolutely.
But it's about being being strategic with foresight and with some kind of scale.
Yeah, two of my least favourite terms are picking winners and corporate welfare.
That's right.
You know, I think the role of government is to create the environment in which individuals and businesses can thrive, and to invest in the infrastructure, you know, bridges and telecommunications capabilities, where government needs to play a role in regulation, in taxation policy that can create a positive or not positive environment. And then really it's up to all of us as individuals and individuals that build or create businesses to take advantage of that environment, to come up with the cool ideas and to apply the science. So investing certainly in fundamental science through the universities, absolutely, public funds to do that. But at a certain point, it's got to be the citizens who are grabbing hold of those opportunities and turning it into successful businesses. I don't get too worried when a company gets sold overseas, because if the founders are New Zealanders who have been really successful entrepreneurs, if the markets, the demand for the company is in the US or in Europe or in Asia, or if there are other reasons they're going to put their manufacturing overseas, it's still a huge success. And the founders, instead of selling just product, the company becomes the product that they've sold to the world markets, and a huge amount of capital comes back, and very often they are repeat entrepreneurs who then and enable other entrepreneurs to get up and get going and start. So they sell one company, and the profit from selling that company might start off 6 or 10 new companies in New Zealand. So I always found it was a bit, the hand-wringing that goes on when a New Zealand company is sold offshore. First is, well, hold on, the people who are whinging about it, did they invest in any of these companies? Did they help raise capital to keep them here or to get them going? But, I think there's a stage at which being known as a country where fantastic companies come out of it attracts that venture capital. It certainly happened for Israel that way. That's right. Yeah, and just all the big venture capital firms now have, offices in Israel because they know that's where this intellectual capability is and where the technology is, and they want to be right there and investing in it. So I think there's an opportunity for New Zealand in that way. And when they see companies being bought out of New Zealand, is a great advertisement that this is a place with a lot of technology, a lot of smart innovators, and a great place to come and bring that venture capital into the country.
Thank you. Let me come back to you in terms of some more questions and some more comments. Julian has the microphone if you'd like to raise a thought or a question. Thank you, lady at the front there.
Hi. Hello?
Yep.
Yoshimi, Brett. My mind's going crazy. Thank you so much to all of you. It's just so stimulating. And what comes up for me is linking this to Sustainable Business Network, when we follow Rod throughout his journey there, and the concept of reshaping profit. And I think a lot of the gems are from Maori culture. And what's come to sort of consolidated in my mind tonight is we talked a lot about triple bottom line and over the past 20 years. And the work that John and I have done always felt there was something missing. And we created a model, and we have people, profit, planet, and the fourth was legacy. And so the work just seems to fit what Rangimarie was saying about the stewardship and the ancestry and honoring that. And that's what it's about. It's taking that forward. So my question is, from Maori, who do it so well, and yet it's taken so long to enable you to do it so well, is to share how we shift, and I know you have your challenges too, to shift mindsets, to reshape profit so that we have a holistic, integrative way of defining profit and adding value and sustaining our planet and our people. So the question is, this new business model, I think we all agree we need. Is that something that's being promoted in Te Wānanga, Aotearoa, in its university studies? I know it's become a very large university, and I just wonder how that the legacy of your business knowledge is being transferred. You say your children are sitting at the dinner table talking a totally different language and very conscious, which is great, and I'm sure everyone else's children here, I think we're all shocked when our children are talking now because they're so advanced. But are we advancing them, are we guiding them to that holistic solution? And it was just one.
Yeah, look, that's a really, that's a cool question. I think there's a couple of things. So I'll start with my kids because, closest to my heart, really. When I think about the business models, to me, the business models are really encapsulated in the language. And so when I'm thinking in Māori first, and then I'm articulating it in a different language and just structuring it so other people get it. So when I think about my own children, will they be able to do that? The answer is yes, because the last 25 years have given them an opportunity to be able to have access to their language. So they have had an opportunity that I never had. Their first language is Māori and mine is not. And so when they think very differently. When we eat in a very different way because we begin in a very different way. When we have, we're sitting at the dinner table yesterday and I'm talking to them about heroes because I'm trying to get this idea. But anyway, talking to them about heroes. Now my heroes are very different to my kids' heroes because all of a sudden my children are talking to me about Kupe and the octopus coming down and the things that the different octopus did, and then talking about Maui and Mahuika and Mum, remember how they did this and they did that. Their whole world view actually is very different, and it's not just a New Zealand worldview, it's an Indigenous worldview, and it is a spiritual as well as a physical worldview, and I think that is dynamic. Is Te Wānanga Aotearoa doing it? I think yes, but when I look at Auckland particularly, because I'm from Auckland, I've lived in Auckland, only 5% of the schools and children that go to school in Auckland will have any chance at all of being able to do that, because we're not teaching that, actually. We're not providing access for that. And I don't think forcing it is the right way, to be fair. I think people make a choice about that. They should be able to do it. So I think you can do that. I think the second thing for me is, as the chief executive of a tribal institution, you know what? I'm the first tribal member ever to be able to be in my seat. And the first thing I've done is said, guess what? Our worldview is actually really cool. And it's so cool that we're going to ensconce our thinking and our behaviour in and amongst that. So our values, our principles and our behaviours will honour the legacy of our people. Now that's taken my people 25 years to back. So it's not a, so can we share it? Absolutely. Probably got some mistakes in there because we've only just had a crack at it. But I think our starting point is an honourable one. I would hope so. We always refer back. What would he say? What would his wife say if they're sitting there looking at us 250 years later? Would they be happy? Would they be sad? Would they be angry? I would hope that they would be proud. So that to me is about the sharing of, and that's something, we can do that in any context actually. It's not just a Māori context, it's a human one. But we've got to do that because we either behave like that or we will lose it. Use it or lose it. And I just think it's so beautiful that it asks you and it requires you to think quite deeply about stuff. So it's the language, simply.
Josh, in your opening comments, you were touching on many of the same questions and issues as Rangimarie in terms of that social and environmental and cultural context. As a Pākehā, how do you relate to that Maori view, and are we seeing something of an Aotearoa expression of these issues emerging?
I think that there's a really interesting phenomenon emerging around the world of people who are, and I think that the expression Indigenous culture, and people who are looking for Indigenous culture to help the way they make meaning of the world, regardless of their genetic heritage and their background and their cultural upbringing. And that I think there's this sense of stewarding the planet, of a spiritual connection as well as a physical one. And I see it's quite linked in terms of youth movements, climate change movements, activism movements, people who are actively trying to shape the way the global systems work. I think there's a lot of affinity towards Indigenous culture. And I think there's also another thing I'm seeing is the role of the internet in all of this is that it makes a whole bunch of stuff visible. So things that could be hidden away in parts of the world that you wouldn't know about now are just so much more accessible to everyone. So it's kind of like anyone with an internet connection can really have a first-hand emotional experience of suffering and loss in the world and the devastation that our way of life is sort of making. And I think that they're looking for alternative ways of being in the world and organising, and I think that that's where there's a natural affinity that I see. I know that as a Pākehā for me, it's a sense of it's really easy to look at the history and see the wounds of colonisation in so many parts of the world. And I think that there's a lot of people who carry grief with that and guilt with that. And like, for example, I was born in Australia. I was born on stolen land. That wasn't negotiated under treaty or given, it was taken by force. And I think that there's a lot of guilt that people carry and a lot of cultural things which people are negotiating around. And it's an emotional thing, it's a felt thing. And I think that there's one of the reasons I chose to live in New Zealand was because of the way Māori are standing up in New Zealand and the possibility that this country could lead the world in healing some of those wounds of colonisation, I think is as exciting for me as the role that we can have for growing cool rockets or spaceships or economy and whatnot. That it's the cultural offering we can give and share with the world, and that learning is quite exciting, I think.
Stephen, you have clearly a very strong sense of New Zealand culture in many different ways, whether it be that strong commitment to the environment and social good, but also the sheer ingenuity of and the way Team New Zealand worked. So how do you think this is coming together for us as a country in this blend of these these similar cultural values, is quite a different expression of what it means to be a New Zealander emerging, do you think? Are we taking something quite special out there to the world?
Hard for me to judge, sort of being from the inside, but the reaction that obviously we got in New Zealand for the week after we came back was quite astounding, really. I think one thing that would be worth commenting on, because it goes back to what Josh said before, is that at the beginning, after we came back from San Francisco, and then after Dean Barker left, we were probably at the bottom of the barrel. There was not much hope. In fact, we almost folded. Grant Dalton actually wrote the letter for the board to say that we were going to close down. And at that stage, I decided that I would try and put some real effort into helping them climb up out of that. And not only was that, with money, but it was with, as Josh said, investing some emotional time in it and chairing the board. And what you do, I think, when you chair a board is that you are there to support the people who are doing the doing. So a board chair should be supporting a CEO to actually enact what you're trying to achieve. And the fact that I went for 2 months to Bermuda and went into the camp every day was just so that everybody knew that I was there to support them. And I think that's the remarkable story, because when we did the pitch poll and it looked like it was all over, then the real true spirit of Team New Zealand got together and patched up that boat, and you know what happened. And from being there right from the beginning, there was a science. I mean, we talk about, Callahan Institute, etc. It was a science project, absolutely no two ways about it. And it's a lot of the guys that work at Team New Zealand also work at Rocket Lab, because they're doing similar technological type work. So it lifted New Zealand's spirits incredibly. Whether it did on the world stage, I'm not sure. There wasn't much television in Italy or an Italian translation, and yet that's the second biggest yachting nation in the world. We know that less than 300,000 people watched it on NBC in the States. We know that once Ben Ainsley was out, less than 20,000 people watched it in the UK. So for us in New Zealand, it's massive. Whether it shows us as a science nation to the world, I'm not too sure. But next time it might.
But in a fast homogenising world where, one country or one product looks ever more like another, is it really important for this sort of strong sense of a New Zealand identity, but also values which are on one hand old, but on the other hand, we're giving new expression to? Is this a really important part about how we progress as a country?
It's very important for us. As I said, I don't think it's too important for the others outside, but it was a story of beating adversity. It was a story about taking the very best technology you possibly could. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many of our basic scientists that were involved got involved in making that boat go faster. There's a lot of stuff that we can't tell you because it was just so out there, so cutting edge. But what it's done is it's made kids believe that little old New Zealand can beat all these billionaires. That Larry Ellison spent at least 3 times what we spent, yet they had Airbus helping them build that boat. There's supposedly the enormous amount of money and technology behind them, but we did it. And we did it with a tiny little budget, and we did it because we were Kiwis working together on a real vision. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, gentlemen there. Microphone, please, just because we keen to capture all this. Thank you.
Both Giles, I don't often get accused of being a gentleman. I have the privilege of working as a facilitator and work on a couple of programs. And I'm curious to listen to that, and it's wonderful to hear the points of the focus and the positivity, and I love that, and I'd like to acknowledge the work of each of you in your way in driving that. But the enemy's really close, And the world that we're living in right now is not actually the one that, whether I'm working in communities of need, of engaging people into employment, whether I'm working with emergent leaders across sectors, or I've got a group of entrepreneurs who've all sold their businesses for 30 million plus and said, put a thing together of how do we be a good owner. And one thing was we need to get hold of Sir Stephen, how do we do that? But, you know, Shimi, I'm mindful of what you said, but also mindful of that actually, you know, Māori is small, right? And actually we sit on a place where this whole institution was gifted by Ngāti Whātua many, many, many years ago, right? With a really clear vision. And Josh, that's what I was thinking of as you said about the measures of investments. Because at the moment, the investment measures that we've got, and Mary, I'm interested in where your battle is, because I think our boardrooms are bad. Our boardrooms are dysfunctional and destructive. The stripping of stakeholder value, right, is a destructive thing, and I think the enemy are really close, and you sit around the board tables with them. I admire you, Stephen, for the things you've done over the years. I remember many, many years ago interviewing you in a previous life on radio, and you were driving a Prius. But I still notice that most of your high net worth individuals are driving Maseratis and McLarens and Bentleys, right? And they are shitting on the environment, which is also what our primary income earning business does. It shits in the rivers and it shits on the environment, and everyone goes, that's fabulous. And when I look at our young people, and you know, and I love that yours are conscious, but let's look at Jay-Z and the worship of Jay-Z and the Kardashians, and he only does his social movements under the name of Sean Carter, right? And he talks about that consciously because he will undermine his own brand with young people, right? You know, around that. So the enemy are there. You've been fighting them 30-odd years, Stephen, overtly, and you know, congratulations on that. Mary, you're with them in some of the most destructive decisions that are made here, and we are but small and we are but few. And I admire your energy and I aspire to have it, right? Wonderful to meet and hear your conversation, but how do we take the enemy on, and where will we win?
If I may suggest a thought there, the enemy, in a sense, yeah.
Saying that if I make $100, but you lose, what was it, 5 each or 90, then that is not, and that's actually the model that we're in currently. That's the dominant model. Right? So that's what I mean. We've talked about some wonderful success and some focus here, but this is the dominant model, and we don't have a kaitiaki of stewardship. What's been handed over, the advice of David about planting these trees was literally scoffed at and laughed at by the minister. Well, then they were like laughing.
So,
Makes sense? the investment currently...
Raja, a response to that about...
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge reality and to look at data that is uncomfortable for us to look at and might make us feel like our efforts are futile or that kind of thing. I think it's really essential that we engage in that discussion. And I also think that it's important that by naming it an enemy and by opposing it and bringing up the paradigm of a battle, we'll just strengthen that paradigm and we won't move beyond it. I think that most people in the world want to do good things, and they want to see a planet that's better for their children, and that they've got much more in common than they've got differences of. And still there are substantial differences, and still people will oppose and laugh and all that kind of thing. But I think it's by connecting with that which is common and then fundamentally creating something better, something that is demonstrably more valuable and more effective, with which will shift the old paradigms. And I think it's phenomenally difficult, and that the challenges we face in the world, there's a real chance that climate change is just going to go run away and there's nothing we can do, no matter how hard we try. There's a real chance that human civilization will just destroy itself. That's a possibility on the table. But if we focus on that, it's like when you're driving on the road and you're looking at the thing you're trying not to hit. You're just going to drive straight into it. I think we really need to be conscious of reality, but be disciplined with our intention, and focus each other's attention on the things which might actually get through and double down on that. So that would be my general response.
I'll have a crack. You know, Giles, you know the saying, nā ku te rauro, nā te rauro kaurai. And so in English that is, by my little bit, by your little bit, so too will the people flourish. And I think that is the way that you crack at the enemy. Because the enemy actually, in many instances, isn't the people, it's the thinking. And so I think we all have a collective role to have a go at that. So I think that's the other part. And when I think about Ngāku Te Raurau, what is my contribution to the, how many million plants?
187 million.
187. Ngāti Whātua's putting their hands up to do 500,000 in 2 years. So that's our contribution, right? So now what we've got to go and do is find 300 mates who's going to come up and do the same thing. And bit by bit, we will get there. And so I'm really passionate about that, not because there's a number that thrills me, because the idea that there are native plants across our city that will bring back our native birds, and there will be songs in the middle of Queen Street because our kereru are fat and beautiful, that turns me on. And it should turn us all on. So, you know, it's not about one person having the answer to that. I think it's all of us having that piece, which goes back to Rod's question, how do we get on the same page? The answer is actually the country probably needs a strategy that isn't dictated by a government, it's dictated by the people. And there has to be a compelling why. And I'm not sure we've got the compelling why yet. And once we figure out the why, we can all figure out our bit on that why. And that, to me, is the Aotearoa story. At the moment, it's the New Zealand story. It should be the Aotearoa story that we can all kind of sing from the top. There you go. That's my bit. 2 years, but give me 2 years. It's got to do some stuff.
Well, I think like a lot of things, it's too difficult to convince people of our age. It's going to be these millennials and the kids coming through now that are going to shape this country, and I'm incredibly optimistic. I mean, not just your kids, but my grandkids and lots of kids I talk to. They think so differently. You know, they're not in this, we'll work 40 hours. We'll work 3 days a week and we'll put something back on the other 2. So I think things are going in the right direction, and I agree. You can't fight the enemy, you know, with a weapon, because as my mother said, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, or things come straight back at you. So I'm optimistic. We just got to keep these kids fueled and support them.
I agree about a strategy, and to do a strategy, there has to be a shared vision of what kind of New Zealand we want. So I say taking a 20-year time frame. I mean, long enough that you can really change things, but hopefully most of us in the room will live long enough to see it. So I think what I'd find pretty exciting is to see how can we have. And I watched that What Matters program, and while it had some limitations, good on them that they sort of got some of the questions out and started the conversation in that way. But what would even a group of this size, would we agree on what an ideal New Zealand looks like in 20 years? And how much commonality would we have about what we're willing to give up for some of the things that aren't working well? I mean, I think that would be kind of a fun thing to participate in some context, is to see, could we describe, here is the legacy we want in 20 years' time? And then the strategy. Okay, so what are the steps to get there? What do we stop investing in? What do we do more of? What do we do less of? I mean, everything comes into play. How much inbound migration do we want? Are we willing to put a much higher price on the cost of certain goods to reflect their true environmental impact, including milk and including water? I mean, just the outcry about, charging companies that are taking fresh water and selling it overseas. How do you make those trade-offs? But I think you've got to just start with, here's the vision for what what the future of New Zealand looks like. I don't know. I'd be interested, whether you think there'd be a lot of commonality across New Zealand.
I hope that there would be, but we're not going to explore that, unfortunately, because it's 7:05. Look, so I'm going to have to bring this to a close here. At the outset, David and I had always hoped that this would be more challenging than your conventional view of what an economic discussion in New Zealand would be like. And when we posed that sense of, are we sowing seeds for something completely different, or are we just continuing toxic bubbles of various kinds? I'd just like to thank all four of you hugely for your very strong perspectives and that very each of you contributing a lot to some extraordinary seeds that are not just planted, they've germinated, they are growing for, I think, quite a different future, whether it be bringing together cultural, social and business in a way that we've not before. But it's certainly about creating a deeply sustainable and very rich future for the country. So, I'd like to offer you lots of thanks. So a very big hand, please, to Mary, to Stephen, to Rangimarie, and to Josh. Thank you.